In my last episode, I described a trip when I didn't know where I was going, and that was true on various levels. On that 500-mile trip through the wild Brazilian West, I really didn't know where I was going or even where I was, for that matter. I was along for the ride, and I trusted Francisco to drive us from place to place. I was in no position to make suggestions on which way to turn on those largely unimproved roads, and that's a very real example of our walk of faith in God, isn't it? As we go through life, God has informed us of our final eternal destination, and we must trust Him to choose the roads He wants us to take on the way there. He knows where all the stops are and all the muddy ruts that we will need to deal with along the road of life. And when we travel by plane, we trust the pilot and his navigator to get us where we're going. Have we learned to trust God to get us to the right eternal destination? If the terrain below doesn't look right or we fly into turbulence, do we decide just to get off where we are? And if we're not pleased with the circumstances in our lives, do we say to God, thanks, but I think I need to take over now? I made that trip in February, but that door was not open for us in God's plan. I thought about other options after that, but none of them worked out. It was mid October, and Jeff was not yet 2 months old when I saw a door opening up. Brother Clovis, who worked as an airline mechanic for the Brazilian airline Varig, was transferred to Porto Alegre. That's about 750 miles further south in Brazil's southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul. He wanted to organize a church down there, so Steve and I made a trip to see him. I was attracted by the opportunity to interact with the community of German immigrants that predominate in the southern states of Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul. I was so impressed that I decided to take our family down there to check out the field. Steve agreed to fly our family down there at the end of November, and we would look for a place to live. That was at the same time we were informed by the owner of the house we were living in Santa Cruz that he was going to sell the house and we would have to find somewhere else to live at the end of the year in any case. That was another indication that God was going to move us. Our family, now with 3 kids, got on the Cessna and we took off on November 27th as planned. But the weather did not go according to our plans. An hour and a half into the flight, clouds forced us to turn back. Change of plans. I put two new tires on the car, sold $50 to Steve, and borrowed another 100 Cruzeiros, about $15 from him, and we left the next morning by car for the 750-mile 2-day trip to Porto Alegre. Clovis was living in Canoas, in the metropolitan area of Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul, and we searched the surrounding towns, but the prices were too high and we thought the houses were too primitive. In Sao Paulo state, where we lived, the houses were made of brick and mortar. Here in the south, most of the houses were built of wood. We finally came across a house near the center of Canoas that had 3 bedrooms, a large yard, and garage. It was made of wood, but because of its size and arrangement, we agreed to pay a deposit of 2 months' rent to hold the house for us until we could make the move in January. I paid a part of the deposit and promised to send the remainder by December 15th, when I could exchange more money in Sao Paulo. At one point in driving around, I went to put gas in the car and realized I had only 2 Cruzeiros in cash, about 30 US cents. We were still over 10 miles from Clovis's house, but by coasting downhill and praying uphill, we made it back to the house. But we were also 750 miles from Santa Cruz do Rio Pardo, with a lot of uphill and downhill in between. I didn't make a note of how we got the money or how much, but we did arrange enough to get home. It couldn't have been very much money because we slept in our Volkswagen Squareback at a service station on the way back home. That was instead of finding a hotel like we had done on the trip down. The car was small, with seating similar to a VW Beetle, but then our family was still small enough to manage somehow. This was one of the many occasions over the years when we had to put into practice one of the Apostle Paul's instructions to Timothy. Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. That's 2 Timothy 2:3 in the King James Version. Other translations say suffer hardship. But in those times, we never felt we were suffering a hardship. We were simply doing whatever we had to do and putting up with whatever it took. That's what soldiers do. Abby and the three kids slept in the back seat and I in the front seat until about 4 before driving the rest of the way home, where we arrived about noon. It was December 4th, and I began making arrangements with a man in Santa Cruz who regularly sent trucks to Rio Grande do Sul to pick up onions. He was willing to take our boxes and barrels of household goods down there for us, and we scheduled the move for January 2nd, after Christmas and New Year's. We started packing up the few things we had in preparation for the move. On December 8th, my 27th birthday, I had 12 cruzados. That was about $2. And I had 1 week to arrange $140 to complete the payment of the deposit on our house in Porto Alegre. The birthday gifts I got that day reflected our financial status at the time. Abby made me a couple of handkerchiefs. Rachel, who was almost 6, wrapped up a 10 centavo coin that was less than 2 US cents. And Rick, he was almost 5, he wrapped up an old billfold and filled it with scraps of paper. He said those were his documents. It's times like that when you realize it has to be the thought that counts, because the monetary value of the gifts themselves aren't. On a grander scale, Steve loaned me 100 cruzados, about $16, for us to get by on, something he and I were used to doing back and forth as the need arose. I was able to get to Sao Paulo on December 17th, and I sent a check in cruzados for the deposit. Another milestone reached. We were about to move. The last half of December was a blur. On December 12th, we got a letter from the Rogers family in Paraguay saying they would be arriving that day to stay 10 days or so. They would be leaving from Sao Paulo for the U.S. around Christmas. They and their letter arrived almost simultaneously. On the 18th, we had a joint 6th birthday party for our eldest, Rachel, and for Philip, the youngest of the Rogers clan. Philip would go on to be a missionary in Chile for many years. He now lives in Mississippi, and whenever we run into each other, we always talk about that birthday party. He insists he is still traumatized, having been left emotionally scarred by the fact that he had to share Rachel's birthday party, and he didn't get one on his birthday. She was born one day before him, and there was no party on the 19th. But there was a surprise that day. Without warning, more visitors arrived to stay with the Montgomerys and us. Bill and Betty showed up unannounced. I remember them as bringing a teenage daughter and a younger son with them. They were related to a pastor we knew here in the States, and they'd just been in Peru with missionaries of their denomination. And wanting to escape the evils of America, they were looking into moving to Brazil. Bill had sold his construction business, but he had to give away his '68 Cadillac. Due to the gas shortage in 1973, the most he could get for his gas-guzzling car was $250. Now, suddenly, there were 25 people staying in 2 houses. There were 4 families with 17 kids, so the girls stayed with us, and the boys and the 2 visiting couples slept next door with Steve and Jeannie. Then on the same day they arrived, on the 19th, Brother Jose, the 93-year-old member of our church, died. His funeral was on the 21st. Then, on the day of his funeral, the 4-year-old granddaughter of a church member was badly burned playing with alcohol and matches. She died the next morning on December 22nd, and she was buried on Sunday, the 23rd. Just a day or two earlier, she had been heard singing to herself, "When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there." Now, who said Merry Christmas? Being in the southern hemisphere in the summer, we knew better than to even dream of a white Christmas, but we would have enjoyed happier circumstances. The Rogers went on to Sao Paulo on Saturday, the 22nd, to stay with the Rosses. And in the meantime, Bill and Betty had decided it would be a mistake to move to Brazil. He went around checking into the possibility of buying land for raising cattle and discovered he would be competing with men who owned 700,000 head of cattle and bought land in parcels of 1.2 million acres. That was out of his league. Betty came over to our house, and she was shocked at the bare necessity level of our existence. Of course, almost everything was in boxes and barrels in anticipation of our move in the next 2 weeks, and that made an even bigger impression on her. The fact remained that our Christmas dinner that year was limited to a bowl of soup. But for us, that was not a hardship. Bill and Betty couldn't resist asking why we were living in Brazil in those conditions. Their denomination teaches that those who profess Christ as Savior can lose their salvation if they don't hold out faithful until the end. I explained that we weren't on the mission field in order to earn our salvation. We were there because we knew we were already saved. We were simply obeying God's call in joyful response to His grace. As I said before, we had been bought with a price, and our lives were not our own. We had enlisted as soldiers, and we simply obeyed His leading. After Christmas, on Thursday the 27th, Steve took Bill and Betty's family to Sao Paulo, and we took their luggage in our car. Steve turned around and went back to Santa Cruz the same day, but we stayed on in Sao Paulo to see Bill and Betty's family off at the airport on Saturday, the 29th. As soon as they took off, we headed back home because we were going to be moving 4 days later on Wednesday, January 2nd. When we got to Santa Cruz that Saturday afternoon, we learned that Steve had never made it home on Thursday. He had fallen asleep at the wheel and had run into the back of a truck, climbing a hill slowly on the highway. We had driven right by the scene of the accident and the town where he lay in a hospital. I entered this in my diary that day. We might have to put off the move for a day or two. I went to see Steve on Sunday afternoon, December 30th, and on Monday, the last day of the year, we learned from the nurses that although Steve might go home Wednesday, the day of our scheduled move, he would have to be taken lying down in an ambulance wearing a neck brace. Instead of us moving 750 miles on January 2nd, Steve would be moved 125 miles to a hospital nearer us for further tests to determine the extent of the injury to his neck. Had God just slammed the door shut in our faces? The door we were convinced had finally been opened to us? On December 31st, 1973, all we knew for sure was that we wouldn't be moving on January 2nd. Whether we moved at all would depend on Steve's condition in the next few days. And we had already agreed to give up the house we were living in.